Welcome to Leaders' Questions.
Well, first, Taoiseach, I think all of us send our thoughts to the families of the children whose spinal surgery was investigated by HICWA in the report. I think you've articulated just there just how appalling the findings are in respect of those children, and I think it's deeply concerning to see them. I note the chair of the CHI board has resigned, so things are moving very swiftly, and I would ask that we might have a proper debate on this in this House this week. I think it's such a serious matter. Could I also I think again on behalf of everyone, express our thoughts with our colleague Deputy Richard Boyd-Barrett and wish him well in his treatment for cancer over coming months. I think Richard spoke extremely movingly and bravely about his diagnosis and his treatment. Taoiseach, less than a week after the Rose Garden announcement, we are already seeing the potentially catastrophic effects of Trump's tariffs. So-called reciprocal tariffs, apparently drawn up on the back of a napkin, are already creating massive global uncertainty, putting entire national economies at risk across the world. And I think the full impact, as we all know, won't become clear for some time. At global level, the tit-for-tat has started with China, and the EU is to later today announce a response to the 25% steel tariffs. It's welcome to hear that whisky, wine and dairy products will be left out to protect EU and indeed our own alcohol and food exports from further reprisals. But the likelihood is that once the EU package is announced, Trump will hit back with further tariffs. And what's becoming clear is that this isn't just about tariffs or customs barriers. Trump's top advisor, Peter Navarro, made clear in the Financial Times yesterday that they are aiming for what they call non-tariff weapons also, including EU regulations, taxes like VAT, data localization rules, and what they're calling lawfare, that they allege targets US tech companies. Navarro singled out EU rules on hormone-treated meat and genetically modified crops. So, Taoiseach, can you offer assurances to Irish businesses, farmers, workers and consumers in light of this imminent and ongoing threat? We know the Taoiseach is flying today to meet with Trump's Commerce Secretary. The Agriculture Minister is in the US already. And I thank you for offering a briefing with opposition leaders later this week, and I hope we'll hear then more about the government's negotiating brief and how to avert the worst impacts of the tariffs. But there are urgent questions today. Workers facing the dread prospect of job losses. We're hearing already from employers, particularly in the medtech and other export sectors, that contracts are being paused or cancelled due to uncertainty, and that what employers and workers need is a short-term, state-backed work support scheme. Indeed, both IBEC and ICTU have called for such a scheme to be put in place, and ICTU have also called for sectoral industry task forces to help manage disruption. What we're talking about, Taoiseach, is a targeted programme. Not the broad wage subsidy scheme that we had in the pandemic, but rather a more targeted scheme to address the real impacts of tariffs potentially in particular sectors. Germany, as we know, is a gold standard in the Kurzarbeit scheme, and Taoiseach, we in Labour have been calling for such a scheme to be introduced for some time. Are you ruling out such a scheme now?
Thank you, Deputy.
Or will you consider it, and what reassurances can you offer those who are facing that dread prospect of potential job losses or layoffs?
In the first instance, I want to join with you in expressing our very, very best wishes to Deputy Boyd-Barrett as he goes through treatment, and we've had many a good joust in the House, and certainly his voice will be missed over the next couple of weeks. So have you, as you said. But we wish him the very best in terms of the treatment he's about to go through, and wish him a full recovery. Could I say at the outset that there's some distance to travel here yet in relation to this issue of tariffs and trade wars. It is very serious and it is very grave, and the first focus has to be, or the initial focus has to be, can we get this onto a negotiation pathway? And you correctly said that issue has been made about, or issues have been raised around non-tariff barriers, and the US have a list of what they perceive to be non-tariff barriers in terms of the entry of US goods, chlorinated chicken or whatever, into the European Union. Likewise, the European Union has a list of similar non-tariff barriers that impact on EU goods getting into the US. In some respects, actually raising that issue, there may be an opportunity in it, because Europe is clear that it's willing to negotiate both the tariff issue but also non-tariff issues in respect of complaints that both sides would have about the other. So the European response has been a measured one, designed to endeavour to get negotiations underway. And I think before we consider any interventions or whatever, I think we must give that opportunity to negotiate in the first instance. The European response in respect of the steel and aluminium tariffs that were imposed by the US has now been published. The earlier list had been one that had been, to be fair, had been there in an earlier era when the older tariffs had been levied. They then had been lifted by both the Biden administration and the EU. And so they were just automatically published again and lifted. Now there's a new set, and thanks to it takes out Bourbon, which is some positive news for spirits and wine, and also dairy products. But of course, they're still subject to tariffs, and we want to get to a position where we can get zero-to-zero tariff arrangements between the European Union and the US. And likewise, then, if we can get a negotiation pathway on non-tariff barriers and any other issues that may be out there and are out there. And that is our approach so far. I spent the last week talking to multinational companies, med tech companies, in terms of how they see it. They broadly endorse the approach. They don't want escalation. Many of them, obviously in the medium to longer term, this would impact. There's no doubt that investment decisions are being paused.
You'll be back.
But people aren't as of yet in pharma or medtech being laid off or anything like that just yet.
Well, I think, of course, it's clear that there is the big hope is that there will be a negotiation pathway open, and I think it's interesting to see the EU already saying that they offered to remove all tariff barriers on industrial goods and to buy more LNG from the US previously. But those offers were met with really a non-response from the EU. And there is a question now about to what extent there will be a response from the US, I should say, to what extent there will be a response from the US. And clearly, Trump is looking for major concessions, but even with those concessions, it's not clear that there'll be any move. So I think, Taoiseach, it is important, therefore, for those here who are desperately worried about the potential impact down the line on their jobs, their livelihoods, their businesses, their farms, that there is some indication the government are now considering the measures to be put in place to offer supports. And as I've said, we've seen other schemes in other European countries that can be adapted for particular sectors that are at risk. On Friday, however, you refused to endorse a short-term work scheme. The Finance Minister spoke in similarly negative terms on Sunday. I think the Taoiseach was a little more open to the prospect of such a scheme more recently. But we do need to hear from government that you're at least considering the prospect of that sort of scheme to support people staying in their jobs and help keep businesses afloat.
I think, look, to be honest with Deputy, whatever we do has to be financially sustainable over the long term. I mean, it's just far too early, I think, to be venturing anything on that scale, on that front just yet. This is not the same as COVID-19, as you've acknowledged yourself. And therefore our response has to be one that is sustainable, but also that we have some sense of where this is going to settle, if indeed it settles at all. But I do believe it will in time, and we will be in a better position to evaluate what the optimal response would be. But remember, if it doesn't settle and say this tariff war continues, that will have implications on everything, public finances, everything. So we've got to be careful in terms of how we proceed, so that anything we do is financially and economically sustainable into the future. I mean, we do need resources to diversify markets. We need resources to invest more in innovation and research. There are things we can do that will, investing in the infrastructure, for example, is key, and so on.
Like, share, and subscribe to stay informed and help drive positive change.